So we're absolutely just thrilled to have our special guest with us today, Sharon Salzberg. She's one of those people who really doesn't need an introduction, but as my colleagues know, I love to do introductions. So I'm going to take advantage of it. But before doing that, I really want to encourage you to submit questions that might come up that you have in the chat. And so my colleague Kai will be monitoring that, and we'll have an opportunity to ask some of those questions to Sharon. So please do so. And so when we talk about Sharon Salzberg, we're kind of talking about the origins of Buddhism in North America, at least, or maybe what we might call the modern West. Sharon's been meditating now for, I think, over 50 years. We were just celebrating the 50th anniversary of one of the centers that Sharon helped co-found, the Insight Meditation Society. And there you could just feel the palpable impact of Sharon's work. She's a pioneer in many regards. Much of her work focuses on practices of the heart, the Brahma Viharas, the four immeasurables, metta, karuna. And me personally, I can say they've constituted a pillar in my practice and invited me into places of healing and growing that wouldn't be possible otherwise. Um, we were just reflecting earlier, getting ready for the event, on kind of the impact that IMS, the center, has had. And I think when we write the history of Buddhism in North America, it'll be maybe the most primary cog in that description. So today we're going to talk about Sharon's work and hear from her about different practices and different experiences she's had. We're going to talk about her wonderful new book, Kind Carl, children's book that my own personal children adore. And then hopefully hear from you all. So again, don't hesitate to put questions in the chat. And Sharon, it is just a utter privilege to have you here today. So thanks for joining.
Thank you so much. It's delightful to be with you all and to hear more about your project, which I'm really eager to, and talk about Kind Carl and other such things. So why don't we start with a period of practice?
Wonderful.
I usually say short period. It's relatively short. We're going to sit for about 10 minutes or so. And I'll offer some guidance. You can certainly sit comfortably, be at ease. Can close your eyes or not. And sometimes we start by listening to sound. It could be the sound of my voice or other sounds. It's a way of relaxing deep inside, allowing our experience to come and go. And if you're not responsible for responding to the sound, see if it can just wash through you. And bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you experience. See if you can feel the earth supporting you. And feel space touching you. Usually we think about touching space. We think about picking up a finger and poking it in the air. But space is already touching us. It's always touching us. We just need to receive it. Bring your attention to your hands and see if you can make the shift from the more conceptual level, let go of fingers, to the world of direct sensation, picking up pulsing, throbbing, warmth, coolness, whatever it might be. You don't have to name these things, but feel them. And on that same level of feeling sensations, see if you can bring your attention to the feeling of your breath, just the normal, natural breath. You don't have to try to make it deeper or different. And find the place where the breath is clearest for you or strongest for you, maybe the nostrils or the chest or the abdomen. You can find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the very next breath, just this one. And it's just one breath. And if images or sounds or sensations or emotions should arise, but they're not that strong, if you can stay connected to the feeling of the breath, just let them flow on by. You're breathing. It's just one breath. But if they are strong and something captures your attention, it picks you up and pulls you away, or you get lost in thought, spun out in fantasy, or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. You can recognize you've been gone. Practice gently letting go and with great kindness toward yourself, begin again. Just shepherd your attention back to the feeling of the breath. No blame. You don't have to do remedial work. We let go and we begin again. No matter how many times you might have to let go and start over, it's fine. The poetic way we say it sometimes is that the healing is in the return, not in never having wandered to begin with. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation.
Thank you so much, Sharon. A wonderful start. You really succinctly hit on a lot of the themes that I hope we can go into, you know, a lot of the themes that have constituted your work, loving kindness, compassion, awareness practices, themes that are so wonderfully illuminated in Kind Carl, which I find tremendously insightful. But maybe before we go there, Sharon, our project, as we know, is focused on children at kind of those earliest formative years. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about kind of your childhood and if there were experiences or people that maybe prefigured your life in the Dharma in some way. Did we lose Sharon? One moment, folks.
I think we may have.
It was such an intense question that Zoom threw me off or something, but I'm
Well,
back.
welcome back. Wonderful.
Yeah, I was in the middle of answering that. I thought, wait, there's something funny. Um, as I was saying, my childhood was really marked by a lot of suffering, and confusion, and yet somehow there was always a voice beckoning me, that said something else is possible. I can't even describe it or locate it. It wasn't like a particular family member or something, it was just there. And it was not until I went to college. I went to college at the age of 16, and I took an Asian philosophy course as a sophomore because there was a philosophy requirement. And honestly, as far as I can remember, looking back, it was sort of happenstance. I said, "Oh, that course is on Tuesday. I'll do that one. It fits my schedule nicely." And it completely changed my life, and I'd say in two ways. One was in talking about the Buddha. They said, of course, the Buddha spoke so much about the suffering in life. And for many people, of course, that's kind of a depressing message. But for me, it was this fabulous message of inclusion. It was like, oh, I'm not so weird. I'm not so different. This is a part of life. And so it was almost like the first time in my life I felt that I belonged. And I can well imagine another kind of childhood, another kind of family. That feeling is instilled right from the beginning, even though, I mean, life is life, even for a kid, right? There are ups and
Yeah.
downs, changes. And then the other thing about the class that I took in college was that they talked about meditation. They said there are techniques, there are methods, which if you practice them, you could actually be a lot happier. And I was going to college in Buffalo, New York, and something just caught on fire within me. Like, I've got to learn how to do that. I've got to learn how to meditate. And I looked around Buffalo and I did not see it anywhere. This is like 1969, 1970. So I did this completely outrageous, out of character thing. The school had an independent study program, and I created a project. I said, I want to go to India and
Mm.
study meditation. And I'd grown up in New York City. I was going to college in Buffalo. I'd never even been to California. And I suddenly said, I'm going to India. And they accepted the project. So off I went. So I've also noticed, not obviously in every instance, but I have been invited into some classrooms, usually Zooming, and I've done a couple of in person things in libraries with Kind Carl. And one fifth grade classroom, and these kids had an app. They were meditating anyway. They had an app for kids. And the first grade classroom that I zoomed into, they had a corner where a kid could go and chill, and little Play-Doh they could play with or whatever, and books, you know that they could look at until they felt more composed. And so there's an understanding about, from the child's point of view, about being out of balance. I'm just dysregulated, or whatever, and that they're tools, you know. And one of the things we've done in every appearance that I've done is, because what, kind Carl does a bunch of things. He learns to take a breath when he's about to blow up. And we say to the kids, okay, take a breath. And they're all used to that. They know about that. And then there are other things as well. So I could see that being given some of these tools in childhood is such a tremendous thing.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Sharon. I really appreciate that honesty and earnest nature. What's interesting, we have one pilot school, Sharon, as we've mentioned, in Kathmandu, where we're testing this methodology that Minga Rinpoche has developed. And a large portion of our children come from traumatic backgrounds due to the kind of the remote regions that they come to, loss of loved ones, and just really challenging circumstances. So we're starting to see some of those possibilities when you infuse that. But I really want to zoom in on what you said right to start. Like, there was pain and there was suffering, and it was just there. How do you, yeah, how do you invite people into that space, children or adults? You've worked with so many people to recognize that yet, as you mentioned.
Well, there's an image that I've used a lot in writing. I keep thinking I have to find another image because I've used it so much. Um, where they say that after the atom bomb dropped in Hiroshima, even further devastation spread when this rumor spread that trees and grass and flowers would never grow again. It's like the laws of nature themselves had blown up along with, the bomb. And when that rumor got dispelled, as terrible as things were, people felt a different kind of resilience, a different ability to go on. And it reminds me of, sometimes we have to look for what's intact, what's not broken, what's not been destroyed. And that's a conscious effort with attention. It doesn't mean we're, covering over or, up leveling or spiritual bypassing or anything, but we're recognizing the need to look directly and honestly at what's painful, and to be able to touch on that which is not broken, because there's plenty, especially if we learn to kind of change the lens. When people, for example, practice gratitude, which is a very healing practice, even for a child,
Mhm.
then, we get confused because we think, well, it's got to be something magnificent that happened, or, grandiose. And we overlook the smaller things that are actually capable of filling us and nourishing us so that we have the strength to deal with what's difficult. And so being able to really focus attention in different ways, I think is a great benefit.
That's fantastic. Yeah, gratitude is a real building block and pillar of the work that we do with children in our school, and I do personally with my children. So I couldn't agree more. And yet, maybe just to say, right, there are those moments when, at least in my own life, and I see it in others, when the suffering is almost unbearable. And you evoked one of the most horrific acts in human history in Hiroshima. Um, what tools how can we interrupt that, Sharon? Because it feels almost unreachable in those moments. Could you speak to that experience a little bit?
Well, I mean, the example came from them, from their experience. It wasn't something that I imagined would be good.
Yeah.
It's like that was their lived experience, and we know from personal suffering, the kind of, as terrible as things can be, and they can be, the added burden of What in Buddhism is called the second arrow, feeling all alone, as one example, feeling isolated in difficulty. I'm the only one. Feeling that kind of projection into an endless future. This is all I'll ever feel. The seeming permanence and solidity of something that's actually changing and moving, but we kind of seize it. Um, the ways that we add to actually Sylvia Borstein, one of my colleagues, tells this story about she was preparing a Passover dinner with her then 9-year-old granddaughter, and I told this story in Ireland, and I had to completely explain everything. So just in case, a very typical thing to eat at Passover and other holidays is gefilte fish, which is this sort of gelatinous uh, combo of many types of fish ground together, um, and so her granddaughter, whose name was Hope, she told her granddaughter, put a piece of gefilte fish on every plate, and next to it, next to the fish, put a large tablespoonful of horseradish, because traditionally that's the way the gefilte fish is eaten. So Hope looked at her grandmother and said, I never realized you could take something truly terrible and make it even worse. And then when Sylvia tells the story, she hastens to say, I tend to make very good gefilte fish. And when I've repeated the story, I've said, I really like horseradish. I don't think it makes it worse. So,
Mhm.
but the principle is right there. It's not saying the original hurt or harm doesn't hurt. I mean, it hurts. In fact, I don't have the right mug here, but during the pandemic when I was teaching constantly online, apparently I said the same thing over and over again, and because people started sending me mugs with some of those sayings. And one of those sayings is some things just hurt. They hurt. It's not because we have a bad attitude. It's not because we need to change our thinking. Some things just hurt. But what we don't need is the extra suffering, and that's where we learn we're not so alone, that this is a part of life, that everything is changing all of the time, that we can't control it. It's not our fault. Like all that self blame and shame and all the things that we tend to add to what's already a difficult situation. That's the freedom that we can have. And so I've just been amazed at seeing, well, your dad, like you're raising children, the ability for kids to admit what they're feeling, that it's allowed, even when it's a kind of crummy feeling. And also the ability to use the tools to not add to it and get enveloped and enmeshed and or hate it, not to add all of that shame. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, I agree completely. And what we're seeing, especially with our youngest students, Sharon, right? They come to our school, age 5, 6, 7, oftentimes. And some of them have been with us now for 4 years, and we're seeing the possibilities if you accompany it with a very subtle touch, encouragement, reminders, if you will. The impact is tremendous.
Yeah.
Um, Sharon, you have studied practice with many of the luminaries of the last, century in our tradition. S.N. Goenka and Sayadaw U Pandita in the Theravada tradition on up to Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, Shoten Rinpoche, and our visionary Mingyur Rinpoche as well. Could you talk a little bit about um, what the teacher means in your experience and maybe how that's evolved over time for you?
Well, I mean, I have been, amazingly blessed, and I've had incredible teachers. And I went to India in 1970, so it was a different world as well. And like maybe you check into a hotel in Calcutta and find out, oh, Juju Rinpoche is also staying here. And he's, hanging out with people at night. And, and it just like, it was amazing. or going up to Sikkim and seeing the 16th Karmapa. And, um, it was really an extraordinary, extraordinary time. Because of that personal relationship and encouragement. So, I'd gone to India. I was 18 years old. My first teacher was S.N. Goenka. It was an intensive 10-day immersion retreat. And I had never been in therapy. I'd had this really rocky childhood, and um, I'm somewhat famous amongst. I made many of my lifelong friends in that retreat. Um, I'm somewhat famous amongst that group of people for once having marched up to Goenka and looking him in the eye and saying, "I never used to be an angry person before I started meditating," thereby laying blame exactly where I felt it belonged, which was on him. It was clearly all his fault that I was experiencing all this anger in my meditation. And clearly, of course, it was not that I just had not faced, so much of what was cooking inside of me. And he just laughed, and um, everything I went through, delightful and very painful, was held by that body of knowledge, by a very loving presence, um, by real purity and intention. That I don't think I've ever had a teacher who seemed to me to be motivated by anything other than the desire for my liberation.
Mhm.
So and some have been really kind of gentle. Some have been really sort of fierce and intense. And of course, there's always, I think, especially for someone that young, um, the desire to mold yourself into the personality type of the teacher, which was really thwarted for me because I had different teachers and they were all so different from one another. And it became clear after a while that it wasn't about adopting another persona, like be like that one or be like that one, but really finding the freedom in who I was and what I was experiencing.
That's wonderful. I've heard some stories from those early days with Goenkaji. Um, Sharon, one of the things that I've navigated in my own practice, and I think many of us do, um, there's almost a wealth of riches these days, right? So you talked about being in Calcutta and Dudra Rinpoche arriving, and you know, at least you were kind of traveling, going to seek them out. Now it's like you turn on YouTube and there's more Dharma videos that you know what to do with. And there can be a challenge in kind of balancing, right? These seemingly disparate elements of the Dharma and trying to find cohesion in an effective way. Did you have that kind of natural ability to find a synergy amongst these disparate teachers, or was it more methodical and kind of shifting your attention?
Um, I don't think I had a natural ability. I think, there was certainly a period of confusion for me. And, um, I started with Goenka and other Burmese teachers. Within 6 months, I was near Darjeeling studying with Kala Rinpoche, you know, older Kala Rinpoche. And, I couldn't decide what to do. And so in effect, I did nothing. I'd sit and meditate,
Mm.
so to speak. And I'd be thinking, should I do this or should I do that? Should I do this or should I do that? Which one's better? Which one's faster? Well, these people seem more enlightened than those people, but I know those people better than these people. If I knew these people as well as I knew those people, maybe they wouldn't seem so enlightened. Which one's better? And so in effect, I was doing nothing. And I finally said to myself, just do something. It doesn't have to be a lifetime commitment, but I did believe right from the beginning, it's about, and this was very much from Goenka, it's about your own experience. And if you're, as valuable as theory can be, and it can be, if that's all you've got and you don't have an experience, then it's always going to be kind of borrowed knowledge. And so I said to myself, just do something for a month. so that you're actually practicing something. And I thought, well, the Theravada, the insight meditation stuff, and I didn't know loving kindness at the time, really. Uh, it seems so simple. Let's start with that. And so then there was a long period where I was uh, maybe taking teachings and appreciating and getting inspiration from other lineages, other perspectives, but I sort of kept my practice contained. And it was only later when I could see what different approaches shared, and so on, that I began practicing also in different ways. But I think that was an important uh, place for me because I have, in the Theravada, uh, when they talk about personality types,
Mhm.
I'm totally a deluded type. I mean, I could have sat there and thought that, confusedly for the rest of my life, and I'm glad that I just said, just do something.
Mhm. I love you speaking about that inner voice, Sharon. I've heard you reference that in other situations, and one story that you tell that I found on your website probably 10, 12, 15 years ago. So I was trying to find it again, but the website's really beautiful and been updated. But it was a story about waiting in a lunch line, if I remember correctly, at a
When I
Goenka.
met Joseph, that one.
The story, what stands out to me, and correct me if I'm wrong because I wasn't able to verify it, but you were waiting in the lunch line and you were thinking, you just acknowledged, this inner voice spoke, you've been waiting for so long. And you talked about letting go of that waiting and kind of shifting the way that you were in your practice. Um, so I might get the story incorrect, but what
Yeah,
stood
no,
out to me
no.
is that
Actually,
inner
it's sort of
voice.
conflating two stories. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
but that's good. Then I get to tell too. Um,
Wonderful. Please do.
the story about waiting in a lunch line was when we sat those 10-day retreats with Goenka. They weren't completely silent. They were silent days and silent periods, but and I had literally not meditated for a moment before I entered that intensive 10-day retreat. And one of the people, I mean, there were so many people, like I said, lifelong friends, including Joseph Goldstein, who was there. And he'd been practicing for about 4 years, I think, at that point. So it was the morning of, one of those days that wasn't going to be silent. And I was so furious at myself because my mind kept wandering away from the breath. And um, I mean, I just hated myself. I couldn't believe how distracted I was and I couldn't meditate. And I said to myself, literally, if your mind wanders one more time, you should just bang your head against the wall. And very fortunately for me, the lunch bell just rang then. So I got online for lunch and it was not silent. And I heard this conversation going on behind me. These two men were talking, and one said to the other, "How was your morning?" And the other said, in the lightest possible way, "Oh, I couldn't concentrate at all, but this afternoon will probably be better." And I was horrified. I thought, doesn't he understand how profound this can be? And you can actually get enlightened if you can, pay attention properly. And why is he taking it so frivolously? And I turned around. Of course, that was Joseph, and he'd been practicing for 4 years. And he had a great wealth of equanimity. Like, yeah, some mornings are hard, and you can't really concentrate, but that doesn't mean what the afternoon is going to be like. And so that was how I met Joseph. The waiting part came just it wasn't then, it was a little bit later working with Manindra in the same compound, basically, in the Burmese Vihara in Bodh Gaya. And Manindra's technique really involved what we call mental noting, placing a label on your predominant experience. So with the breath, silent label. So with the breath, it might be in, out, in, out. And then if something arises, an emotion, a certain state, and you can find the word easily, you place a label on that, like joy, joy, or anger, anger. So that's the nature of that technique. So we were instructed to try to label all day long one predominant experience or another. And I found myself walking around this compound mentally repeating, waiting, 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 waiting. And one day I asked myself, what are you waiting for? And I realized I was waiting for something important enough to happen or spiritual enough to happen so I could label it. I realized I was living as though a tape recorder with the pause button on, and that I could label an any old ordinary thing, a breath, the feeling of my feet against the ground, a breeze, anything. And that was really bringing the practice to life in that way. So it's that story.
It's
Waiting.
funny how the mind conflates things, but what wonderful stories.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I'd love to talk a little bit, Sharon, about Kind Carl. And maybe before we go into the content, I just imagine, right, you've over 50 years, you've worked with people of all different kinds and all different professions and kind of orientations and so on and so forth. What drew you to shift and speak to children directly? What was that process like for you?
Um, I had been thinking, I hadn't really thought about writing something or working with children. I did have the thought that because Loving Kindness was my first book, and it was really like a practice manual for that kind of writing. It came out 23 years ago, almost 24 years ago. I had been thinking about it'd be interesting to try to do a young adult version of Loving Kindness. There's so much self-hatred and loneliness and different things. It would be very challenging, but I thought, oh, that would be interesting. And it was then that Shambhala approached me because they had a line of children's books, uh, Bala books, and they said, well, how about a children's version of Loving Kindness? And so it was really their inspiration. And they had Jason Gruel, who's done a bunch of children's books for them, and certainly had a capacity that I didn't have. I had worked some with Richie Davidson on the curriculum he developed for, I think it was like 5 and 6 year olds, and
Hmm.
uh, in kindness practices, and so that was really helpful. And I realized things like in the medit in the there's some exercises in the back of Kind Car, like meditations, loving kindness meditation for kids, and uh, I realized things like I needed to have things be concrete. So I'd say things like, what's the feeling like you're about to cross this crazy busy street and someone holds your hand? We call that safe. That's the feeling of being safe. And that's what we're wishing for our friends, and other people. And so I sort of realized there was going to be a challenge in those ways, and I really welcomed it. And my joke was that my books are having fewer and fewer words, like uh, these days. I think, like Joseph Goldstein, I think Kind Carl is his favorite of anything I've written. It's like number 14. Um, and I refer to it, in my mind when I'm working with people who are adults, just different parts of Kind Carl where, he takes a breath or he
Hmm.
resolves, what's one kind thing I can do every day, things like that. And I find my mind keeps going there, instead of something more elaborate and fancier.
Beautiful. Well, it's interesting, Sharon. I've worked with adults and also with children. And what I'm finding to be helpful, supportive in the way that you've just said is like it kind of simplifies it. And we need to make it very applicable. So, like, I think Kind Carl does this so well that it's like it gives very real world examples. So when my 4 year old hears it, he says, oh, I have that experience. And sometimes as an adult, we get lost in that superficial abstract language, but yet here it's so grounded. So just first off, bravo. It's not easy doing this.
Yeah.
So the piece that I think is most innovative, Sharon, and I wonder how this will land for you is, in the Tergar Schools project, we teach five core characteristics, which are not surprising, but awareness, love, compassion, wisdom, and joy. And I think in my observation of kind of uh, how Buddhism is arising in schools, if you will, and by Buddhism I mean kind of people extracting practices and elements of the tradition, is mainly in mindfulness, right, and kind of calming practices, which
Mhm.
are very helpful. But with Kind Carl, you're talking about how the mind functions in a way, right? So like I'm reading it and it's almost a book about nature of mind, if you will, in a way that's very relatable. Like, where do these thoughts come from? Asking those simple questions. Was that the impetus, or how did that process unfold in talking about the nature of mind?
I think the core was really kindness, but I think of compassion, like self-compassion or kindness, as almost like the secret ingredient in mindfulness, and
Mhm.
it's often not articulated or expressed. It's like one of the things, and one of the passages that people refer to the most uh, in Kind Carl is when Carl makes a mistake. He makes a spelling mistake at school, and he freaks out and he loses his temper and
Yeah.
runs out of the school. And then he has all these burdensome thoughts like, I'm stupid. No one likes me. I have no friends. It's never, I'm never going to change. I'm just a crocodile. And and then as you say, he challenges those thoughts. Like, wait a minute, like that's not true. As Sonny Rinpoche would say, it's real, but like it's really what you're feeling, but it's not true. It's not pointing
Yeah.
to an essential truth. And then what he learns to do is he takes those troublesome thoughts and he puts them in like clouds and lets them
Mhm.
float away, which is
Yeah.
sort of the pivotal meditation instruction. Don't
Yeah.
take it to heart. You don't have to become it. You need a little space from it so you can see it for what it is. Let it go. Um, and that interestingly, like I had a few friends, kids, or grandkids, uh, as my first readers, and they say, "What do you think
Yeah.
about this?" And like with a 10-year-old, I thought, well, they'll think they're too old for it. So I said, what do you think a younger kid would get out of this? And everybody pointed to that section. Like, I really liked it when you put those thoughts in the clouds, let them float away. And it's both productive of kindness toward ourselves, and it's only possible when we have some kindness toward ourselves, because otherwise we just identify so much, with those thoughts, and they grow and grow inside of us, and we have no space from them. And
Mm. So tell me then, if I frame the question as such, in writing this book, is there an element of it, Sharon, that you kind of hope children might take with them into their adult life? And is there a core to it? And how would you describe that?
I think there are many elements. That's why, like going into schools, we've always done exercises. Okay, now what it's like, and I'm not alone doing this. I always have somebody with me, much more experienced working with kids than me. Teach them a little loving kindness song or something. But
Yeah.
let's take a big breath. What's that feel like? And they often, in those particular schools, they're familiar with that. And then we do it together. And what's the one kind thing you're going to do each day? Like, I'm going to thank my mom. I'm going to do this. I'm going to thank the bus driver. And then practicing. What do you do when you have a really big feeling? Like there's Carl all freaked out, because he made that mistake so publicly. And what do you do? And it's a lot of stuff about let's take those thoughts, let them float away, let them go. Um, it's sort of the whole point,
Mhm.
that there's an exemplar who happens to be a crocodile, and uh, that they're actual tools, and they get that. It's. I mean, I've heard stories. We also made a bunch of stickers and things like that. So
Mhm.
there's merch, but you know, uh,
Yeah.
I've heard like there's someone's child who said, they're saying now is, what would Carl do?
Wonderful. That's wonderful, Sharon. Selfishly, one of my children's favorite foods is crepes. And
Mm,
my son actually made that same spelling mistake when we were talking about how to spell crepe. So it has been just solidified in his mind, Karn Carl, those connections. I'd be remiss, Sharon, if I didn't ask. I love the dedication, which reads, "To my goddaughter Willa and her sister Josie, who taught me the magic of a child's loving heart." Could you say a few words about Willa and Josie and what your relationship has been like with them?
sure. So I met Willa when she was maybe 3 years old. I had, her
Mhm.
mother. I had met her mother and then her father, but I met Willa when she was about three, and she said to her mother afterwards, Sharon is my fairy godmother. And her mom said, well, you have to ask. And she said, you can ask, but it is, it's true. So they asked me, and I said, wow, that would be incredible. I'd love that. Uh, Josie, her younger sister, they were both born in China and adopted. Josie is Joseph Goldstein's goddaughter. So we each have a goddaughter in the family. And Josie, the younger sister, had a godmother as well. So she had two godparents, and Willa only had me. So she was feeling kind of bummed about that. This is some years
Oh,
later. And so her mom said to her, well, who would you like as your godfather? And she said, Sonny Rinpoche, because I had brought him by the house a few times. And her mother, she's going to kill me for telling this story, to her eternal shame, said, aim lower. But then she told me the story, and I said, I'll ask him. So
mhm.
I asked him, and he said, yeah. I mean, in his mind, I think is like taking refuge with him, and that. So she has Sonny Rinpoche as a godfather and me as a godmother.
Mm.
And she's like 28 now. But I tell a lot of stories about her because she was always remarkably wise. And um, I'll tell you one story, one Willa story. When she was like 7 years old or 8 years old, something like that, her mother brought her to London. They were on vacation. And in New York, they live right near the World Trade Center. So they happened to be in London at the time of the uh, metro bombing. There was a bombing. And so that was like the second time in Willa's young little life that she had been sort of somewhat close to a terrorist incident. So her mother told her what had happened, and Willa said, let's pray. So they sat down together, holding hands, and Willa, being like 8 years old, said, I want to go first. So Willa went first, and this was her prayer. May all the bad people find the love in their hearts. And I always hold that in contrast to so many of us in New York. We're like, am I safe? Are the subways safe? And obviously, we live in a time where there's nothing easier than to witness what we feel are people who are bad and to feel hatred and fear rather than wishing for them to have the love in their hearts. And when people ask me, as they should, how are you talking about loving kindness or compassion toward these people who are causing so much pain and suffering? I always think of Willa. This is what we're really wishing, not that they be triumphant, in their actions or be pleased with themselves because of the harm they're causing, but may they find the love in their hearts. May we as well. So she's an incredible being.
That's beautiful. It reminds me, you're describing your relationship with her, Sharon, describes me of a principle that we hold in the Tergar Schools project that our mutual friend Susan Kaiser Greenland shared with us, and she said very early on she had this phrase arise in her own inner voice that said, "Serve the child in front of her." And when we do that, we're able to kind of, there's such inspiration that can come back in that mind and in that spirit and the magic that you speak about, that magic that is just encapsulated. So really appreciate those stories. Yeah. So what's next after Kind Carl, Sharon? Are you in the children's book writing business, or what's up next?
Well, I have a workbook, also fewer words than a normal book, coming out on loving kindness in January.
Wow.
And I I believe there will be some kind of sequel to Kind Carl with, I'm told, maybe a different main character with Carl being there, but I want to do one on sympathetic joy, joy in
Mhm.
the happiness of others, and ultimately all four of the Brahma Viharas. But sympathetic joy seemed like a good next step. And also, I'm talking about um, uh, an adult book, a
Yeah.
grown-up book on uh, suffering and the end of suffering. And I thought
Mm,
it's pretty core. When you use the word
certainly.
in the introduction, cog, I've been trying to think of the word like for that central principle. And I thought, well, cog is not that selling a word, but
Yeah,
it's the right word.
sure. A utilitarian word, perhaps, but that's fantastic to hear, Sharon. We're going to take a break in a couple minutes, but maybe one last question, and appreciate everyone who submitted questions. Please continue to do so. Um, so maybe just like you said, right, when you're in that room with children, you encourage them to engage in one act of kindness, right, and very pragmatic. We have some listeners here today. What would you leave each of us with? What is one kind of small or real practice that we can engage in our lives, maybe inspired by Kind Carl?
What I mean, there's so many because life is so rich, but what, uh, well, two just came to my mind, but I'll do one. I've been really practicing gratitude lately in a very conscious way. It's much easier, of course, to spend all our time doom scrolling and seeing what's wrong, and there's plenty that's wrong, and but to spend just a few moments, like anything else happened today, uh, I think is it's so heartening. And when I was researching awe, the quality of awe, because I was going to write something about it, I always thought of awe as like what we feel when we go to the redwood forest and we see the majestic trees or something. But it turns out that one of the greatest sources of awe is seeing goodness. It's called moral beauty, and we see the goodness someone else is doing, and that's what fills us. And so I look for that, very consciously.
It's fantastic. A perspective change, perhaps, really. Um, well, this has been fantastic, Sharon. So I'm going to invite my colleague, Kai Johnson, our Director of Operations, to come on and talk for a few minutes about the project. And then we'll get to some of the questions. Thanks to those who submitted them during the session. Continue to do so. Also, those who sent some beforehand, I'll collate those together and we'll continue the conversation. So, Kai, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Justin. Thanks so much, Sharon. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to this and listening to some of these stories. My wife and I have a 5-month-old at home, and so all of this just hits home in a way that it didn't previously. And yeah, it's just been fabulous to hear. Um, I'm going to share my screen in a second. As Justin mentioned, if you do have questions, please pop those into the chat now. We'll go to question and answers segment after this. And let me just get my screen up. Sorry, one second. I have a new computer and I haven't allowed uh I might not be able to share my screen. That's okay.
Happy to do so, Kai, if you just send it to me.
Sure. I'll send you the link
Thanks.
right now. Here you go. As Justin is getting that up, so I'll just talk a little bit about Tergar Schools and introduce you folks to Tergar Schools for anybody who may be seeing us or meeting us for the first time. Tergar Schools is a project under Mingyur Rinpoche, who's a meditation teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And we're part of his global activities that are spanning all across the world. And one second. And so Rinpoche's had an interest in education basically his whole life. And this started, you can see him here. This started from his own childhood when he was growing up in the Himalayas and in Nepal, and then continued on as he continued traveling the world and engaged with students and teachers and parents and faculty and experienced education in a whole bunch of different environments and contexts and situations. And so he's had this interest in him for quite a long time. And so the main thrust of our work here at Tergar Schools is how do we prepare students for the future? And when we're looking towards the future, if we imagine out 10, 20, 50 years, 100 years, it feels really hard to predict what that world is going to look like. If we think of AI, of climate change, of geopolitical instability. It feels like we're entering into a world that has almost unprecedented uncertainty to it. It feels like things are changing so fast and so rapidly, it's really, really hard to catch up. So it feels really hard to be able to prepare students for these futures that feel very unknown. That external piece feels like it's sort of out of our control. But what we feel like we can do is prepare them to build this inner capacity, this inner resilience, so that no matter what comes at them from the external world, they're able to engage with that, not be overwhelmed with that, and really take that on. And so, as you can see on the screen, it's this thing of not preparing them for every future, but being able to prepare them for any future. And so that's the main part of our work. And Justin, if you go to the next slide. And so the actual piece of our work currently, as Justin mentioned, we have a school in Kathmandu, just under 100 students that are there currently. We're building a new campus. It's about a couple hours away from our current school, and that will have up to 600 students that would be there. And then we're also in the progress of expanding across the Himalayas, across South Asia, into other partner schools, and a couple of other projects that will be there. And that's the core backbone of our work currently, right now. But the beating heart of our project, this thing that comes through everything, is a model of learning that is being developed by Justin, by Mingyur Rinpoche, and by others that is really taking everything we talked about here today and injecting that into the learning environment, into the classroom, into the school, rippling out into the community. And that being focused, pulling directly from the lineage of Mingyur Rinpoche and being grounded in this idea of basic goodness that we have this inherent capacity of goodness, of ability to be able to get into these pieces. And from that, then, as Justin mentioned, spring awareness, love, compassion, wisdom, and joy. And so that is the core part of what we're doing. And that is something that we hope to expand as well. We're marinating that in the Himalayas right now. So this tradition is coming from this region, and we're really spending the time being able to produce it there, to cultivate it there, to see what works and see what doesn't work, with then the hope and the aspiration that it will spread more widely in the future. And as I mentioned before, what we're hoping the outcome of this would be is to prepare these students to have that inner resilience. And so to be resilient, to be able to access and engage with challenges as they come up without being overwhelmed by that. To be altruistic, meaning to have a true um, interest in the well-being of others and an orientation towards that, and to be joyful. And that joyful is is a deep, settled contentment that's not dependent on those external circumstances. So that's that piece of preparing them for any future. Justin, do you have anything to add? Anything I missed there? Good, great.
No, I think it was very elegant, Kai. I think Mingyur Rinpoche's vision for this project, like you said, and just to highlight it, is to really give increased awareness to kind of the traditional confines from which our tradition emerges, so the Himalayas. And as opposed to kind of superficially addressing it and extracting some principles, to really go deep and look at not only how practices that calm the mind and the nervous system, practices that open the heart, but also the more esoteric practices like visualization, imaginative practices, and Vajrayana. How could those be applied in the case with children to kind of further leverage this tradition?
Wonderful. Thank you. And so for anybody, if you're interested in learning more about the project, if you're interested in getting involved in some way, I'll just share a couple of links here. First is a link to our model of learning, a brief overview of that. You can take a look at that on our website. The second thing is if you're interested in understanding what we're doing and staying in touch, a really good way to do that is through our newsletter. We do a monthly email newsletter that keeps you up to date on what's going on. And that's the second link. And then third is we're also doing a small campaign currently to help support the school in Kathmandu, and that's running for this week essentially. And so if you feel compelled in any way to be able to support us in that way, that would also be wonderful. So I'll share the link here. Also mentioned we are at currently and then sporadically looking for volunteers. And so if you go to our website, we have a couple of volunteer opportunities that are up there. And so that's something that you can get interested in and engaged in also. And that's the quick shout out from me. Thanks so much, guys. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Kai. Always good to experience some technical difficulties to make sure we're focused. Um, so Sharon, we've collated some questions before the session, and we've had a few additions here. So if it's okay with you, I'll kind of run through some of those
Sure.
questions. The first one has to do with parents and teachers kind of feeling stretched or overwhelmed. And so this person asks or states that the idea of adding some type of practice can feel like just another thing. So how do we kind of shift our perspective to maybe take those steps but not feel so overwhelmed?
Well, it's interesting because some of when we first started teaching, everything was just available to everybody. We never really even knew who was in the room, and what they might do. And over the years, there have been times and increasingly in some ways that I've really felt moved to work with people we call caregivers, either in their personal lives or in their professional lives, or really in some ways on, the front lines of suffering and struggle and trying to make this a better world. And I'm just fascinated by, first of all, how underserved those people are, and the need for some kind of resilience. Because like this sort of happened at the time of a lot of emphasis on empathy training, and I knew those people, and I thought they've got plenty of empathy. They're burning out for some other reason. It's not from needing empathy training. And so really learning, from them and seeing things about, a lot of compassion for others and not for themselves necessarily, and a sense of really wanting to make a difference without what we would call wisdom or realistic limits, or equanimity. Not everything happens at once, right? Sometimes you're just planting a seed. And so, and my definition of who is a caregiver began expanding. I would lead these retreats or workshops, and people would call and say, I'm a school teacher, can I come? Or, I'm a manager, I try to take care of my staff, can I come? Or even, I'm the kind of person who, in my friendships, I'm always taking care of others. It's very hard for me to receive. Can I come? And so my vision has really expanded and changed, but that's basically it. You don't want to undertake a meditation practice as like a task and something, burdensome in and of itself. But An exercise we have done with everyone, from domestic violence shelter workers to uh, teachers to therapists to I did a whole program which I'll tell one story about military caregivers, chaplains, and medics. Um, we have them. Let's say you're journaling, and in the first column, write down what's the most, what's the biggest source of stress at work, and that's just interesting, because sometimes you would think it's like the massive system I'm trying to change, but often it's like bad communication with colleagues or something like that, and that's just interesting to note. Then in the next column, we'd say, write down what you do to get a break, to get perspective, to take a breath, to get some ease. And people would write down all kinds of things, like listen to music or go out in nature, or some people have a strong faith tradition, or sometimes people would write down things like, I drink a lot. And then in the next column, we'd say, look at the last column that you just wrote, what you do for resilience, and write down how you feel about it. And for the people who had written, I drink a lot, sometimes they'd say, ooh, maybe I need some other tools. And so this is the true story. I was working with military caregivers, and somebody wrote down, I get out in nature, I kayak, it's, so amazing, and it gives me such perspective. And then in the next column, he wrote, I guess I haven't done it in about 7 years. So sometimes there are tools. We're just so tired, we're listless, and we don't pick up the tools we already have, let alone maybe a new one like meditation. And just that reminder, this is taking a toll, this is unsustainable. Let's just, if it's kayaking, maybe get in a kayak, don't wait another
Mhm.
7 years. And if you want to undertake meditation, as I'm sure you know from the work of different scientists. Like one example would be Amishi Jha at the University of
Mhm.
Miami, and who works with people in high stress professions, the military, high performance athletes, first responders. And she says 12 minutes a session, 3 to 5 times a week, is actually changing people's lives. That it's not a question of 15 hours sitting in a pretzel like pose, or you get nothing. It's not that big an investment of time.
It's remarkable. I've heard similar scientific suggestions, and yeah, it doesn't take as much as we might imagine, but yet it is quite. We have to take that first step. So appreciate that. So our first question live in the session was, I have a question about my 10-year-old son. He's in a public school and really hates it a lot of the time. Sharon, do you have any thoughts about assisting kids who hate school?
Oh, I should ask you that. I don't know, like not being a parent myself. I'm just always warmed by those stories of like a kid finding their tribe in a way, finding their
Hmm.
people. And I hear a lot of stories about, uh, you know, maybe that's a theater program,
Hmm.
something that allows them to really express feelings, to work on a project with somebody where everybody has a place, everybody has a role. And it may not be certainly in the formal classroom, but there's often something that, and especially, public schools are uh, really struggling in so many ways, and it may not be, music or art or the kinds of things, but that is a place where, um, some kind of expression, whatever it is, I think can really um, challenge some of the kind of binary or dualistic perspective of a formal classroom, like you failed, Um, like Carl throwing that eraser at the blackboard when he spells crepe wrong. Uh, there's so many ways that could be approached, helping him deal with his feelings, but it didn't happen in the school. it
Yeah.
had to happen at home. But maybe it's because I just know a fair number of people in the theater. They all talk about their school experience. It had nothing to do with the classroom. It was the
Yeah.
school play. What do you find with your kids?
Yes, really appreciate your response, Sharon. I think it's true. We need to find that point of connection, right? And as an educator, we try to talk about like you find like a hook. How do you draw people in? Because once they have that commitment, that inner interest, then the job's basically done. Speaking to the parent, though, I have a number of people in my community who are struggling with similar challenges. And I think there's a really important piece to this to kind of not be too hard on yourself as a parent. Because, right, children are going to ebb and flow. They're going to have their own experience. So it's like, how do you create a supportive environment, but not take it personally when something goes wrong? I think that's just as important. Because the reality is, I think, right, you look at statistics, the kind of the sense of isolation and the sense of loneliness is rising at exponential rates among young people. So I think our schools are not serving them in some of the best ways that they can. So it's a challenging situation. Certainly do our best to have them find that point of connectivity. But I think it's also really important to have that kindness for ourselves because it is really challenging. Yeah. Yeah. Another question that came in today. Would Sharon have any suggestions on making a life or career following our true interest and curiosity? And I'll preface this, Sharon, before you respond by just saying that um, I had dinner with a mutual friend who was involved in those early years of IMS that we spoke about before the call. And they were talking about how people were getting second jobs and no one really knew was this going to work. So I imagine like there was a real distinct choice for you in following what I assume right has been your true calling in teaching meditation. And so yeah, how do we do that? What are your suggestions?
Well, when we started IMS, we moved in on Valentine's Day, 1976, and uh, our mantra for that first year was we can always sell in a year. If no one here in this country wants to learn this form of meditation or meditation at all, we just sell in a year. And we didn't have to, but uh, I think, one both there's a certain sense of finding your people here too, as an
Yeah,
adult. And it's a communal effort, and that's its own satisfaction, that you're doing something together, you're figuring out something together. And then I think that as a kind of inner strength is something to do with not falling into praise and blame, and having a different sense of integrity. Like, I don't mean like ignoring feedback or being unrealistic about things, but there's a certain need most of us are acculturated to, which is about other people's approval and acclaim and fame or whatever. And it doesn't always happen. It's a world of in those winds of change of pleasure and pain and gain and loss and praise and blame and fame and disrepute. There's praise and blame. And we need to land our sense of the rightfulness of our actions somewhere else. Not again, it's not about ignoring feedback, it's just understanding. Like the story I usually tell is, Loving Kindness was my first book, and it took me forever to write. If you ever get a copy of the original hardcover, you see the blurbs, either Stephen Levine or Jack Cornfield said, we've waited a long time for this book. And the other one said, in this long awaited first book. And Joan Halifax originally said something like Sharon Salzberg has finally given us, I made
Mhm.
the publisher take out finally. It took me a really long time to write the book. And then it was out. And I was in California and I had lunch with somebody. And she said, oh, Sharon, You wrote that book in such a way, it's just like sitting down and having a conversation with you. It's just like being with you. And I was so thrilled. I thought, it was probably not a nicer thing someone could say. And I was so excited that I was having dinner that night with a whole other group of people. And I brought up the comment from lunch, and someone at dinner said, "Well, that's not true." She said, "I'm reading the book, doesn't sound anything like you. It's nothing like
Mm,
being with you." And I thought, okay, you can be ecstatic at lunch and depressed at dinner, or you could take a moment and realize it's the same book,
mm,
written with whatever my intention was at the time, with whatever level of skill I could bring forth. One person thought one thing, another person thought another thing. And I don't want to pretend I didn't notice the difference or didn't care, but the question becomes, how much do we care? Those winds of, as the Buddha said, there's always blame in this world. If you say nothing, some people will blame you. If you say a lot, some people will blame you. If you say just a little bit, some people will blame you. And so I think in order to have a fulfilled life, we have to land our sense of integrity somewhere else, not
mm,
in sort of just the things we can't control, like what is my intention in going to work every day or in a conversation and having someone was just talking to me about having to lay off somebody, like what's my intention? And how is that, what's the expression? What's the manifestation of that? How skillful? If I have to fire somebody, do I shout it across a crowded room? Like, learning skillful means and doing the best we can and learning from, honest feedback, but not being so bound and determined to have the eyes of the world affirm who we are, because it's never going to happen.
mm,
And then it's a lot more fun.
mm. Yeah, it certainly takes courage, Sharon, and I can certainly empathize with the winds and how they impact us. So, but thank you for sharing that. So next question reads, how can we help children see kindness and introspection as strengths rather than weaknesses through children's literature, daily practices, or education?
I think it's a fascinating question too about children's literature because there, I think, is, a growing body. I think of, um, I mean, Shambhala Press, just as one example, has that entire line of children's books. Um, and, I mean, the original book, Susan Kaiser Greenland's, A Mindful Child, and she has a newsletter, right, which has a lot
She
of
does, yeah.
exercises and things like that. And um, I think daily practices, like I have found, also it started with Willa, my goddaughter, who went to a Quaker school.
Mm,
And so there were periods of silence, every week when they had assembly. And so one day I said to her, "What do you do when you're supposed to sit being silent?" And she said, "I just think about stuff." And I said, "Well, do you want to learn how to meditate?" And she said, "Sure." So we did both a breath meditation and then a loving kindness one. And again, it's sort of kid language, very concrete. And then her mother said, "Which one did you like better?" And she said, "That loving kindness one." And so I find that a lot of kids, it's especially like at night, thinking about their
mhm,
day and the kid who got into trouble at school or something very real, that uh, weaving some kind of actual, I'd say formal, informal, formal loving kindness practice seems to be a way that uh, kids also recast their relationships, like,
mm,
oh yeah, I was mad at that kid today, but I kind of hope they feel better tomorrow, then they can act better, something like that.
mm. Wonderful. Thank you, Sharon. Maybe one more. You've been so generous with your time. Really appreciate it. Um, So this question reads, thank you so much, Sharon, for your generous and life-changing teachings. Thank you to you and other mindfulness and loving kindness practices are now mainstream and in many areas like education, the workplace, and healthcare, as Justin stated, now so widely available. From your view, what would you like to see more of? And what would you like to see less of in terms of practices that are taught?
I don't know that I want to see less of practices that are taught, so much as it's such a vast expanse of possibility, that um, when I started teaching, actually, even, everything was in retreat um, forms. You had to do retreat, and there were no classes pretty much. It wasn't really an experience, but that has certainly grown and developed. I think anyone who's, for example, using an app, and there are many, at some point has expressed a longing for a sense of community, not to feel so alone, in their practice. Um, and as much as we emphasize practice, there is obviously a role for study or understanding the context within which we're practicing. I think the Buddha said something like, if you study, your path becomes very broad, which I think is true. Like I certainly, as an example, was very attached to a particular method, and I thought it was um, really the best and only method because I didn't understand that methods were all about cultivating certain things, certain qualities, and that there were many ways and many approaches and things like that. And so it was only with a greater understanding that I could have a broader perspective of different approaches. And so I think, it's probably been important that practices have been introduced, almost like kind of standalone possibilities because that's been really helpful to people. And probably, we're going to see like a recontextualization
Mhm.
of these other aspects like community, sangha and study and things like that, which I think will make it more complete.
It's fantastic. Mingyur Rinpoche likes to say that he feels this current era, there's added emphasis on the Sangha, the third jewel of developing community. So I really appreciate that. And the way we kind of describe our project is kind of a growing community. And so having you here with us today, Sharon, making this connection, having everyone here looking on and listening, the wonderful questions, slowly growing a movement within education and more broadly kind of with children is really meaningful for us. So thank you so much for joining, Sharon. It's just tremendous. I
Thank
hope
you
you'll
for
come back
having me.
and yeah,
I
I
would
hope
love
you'll come back
to.
and visit again.
Yeah, thank you. And I signed up for your newsletter, so I'm going to get all that information.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Please others do so. Kind Carl, I mean, go out and buy a copy. It's bringing increased wisdom into our world, increased wisdom into my own family. So Sharon, thank you for that offering. Can't wait to see your next offering. Sophia, maybe you said the emu
The
will
email.
be on
Yeah.
the lookout. But so much wisdom shared today, so much appreciation, Sharon. So, and thank you everyone for joining and listening. So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah. Stay connected, everyone. Take good care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.